We are right at the top of the hour here. Should I go ahead and start or wait till 11:01?
Nope, I think you're good. Go ahead.
All right. Well, first off, everybody, thanks for coming. I believe I'm the second to last in our month-long session of free training on improvements, changes to SQL Server 2016. We're all pretty excited about it. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. Hopefully you've made it to many of our other sessions where we've drilled down into some other areas. Mine will focus on changes they've made to AlwaysOn, specifically the availability group portion of that. As you may know, those were introduced in SQL Server 2012, and they underwent a few changes in 2014, several changes here in 2016. So we're going to go through and talk about a few of those. I would love to do a deep dive on all of these. The hour doesn't really allow that, but I'm happy to entertain any questions you guys have. Go ahead and submit them through GoToMeeting, and I'll try to take, for sure, some time at the end, and possibly, if we can, maybe a break in the middle as well. So the title of this is New Features and New Speed, and a New Space too. If you're a bit of an always-on dork like I am, one thing you'll note is that for 2012 and 2014, the marketing stuff all had always on as one word, capital A, capital O. Microsoft Marketing for 2016 has decided to add that space. So along with all the new features, it's much faster, lots of cool stuff. We have a cool new space as well. So I am Matt Gordon. I'm a senior consultant for us. You can find me on Twitter at SQL@Speed. And if I don't get to your question today, or if something pops in your head after the session, feel free to tweet at me, and I will do my best to answer it as deeply as 140 characters will allow me to do. So we're going to dive right into it here. First slide covers one of the things that I'm most excited about, which is why I put it first. Previous versions of this, there was no load balancing of your read-only replicas. And if you're not familiar with what those are, just a brief, like, 30-second crash course. Basically what those are is you've got your primary. Once you set up your AlwaysOn AG, you establish replicas, and those can be in different modes, and that's kind of out of the scope of what we're talking about today. But one thing you could do is you could make those replicas readable, which allowed you to point read-only workloads at them. And so that would allow you, a lot of times you have an app, as it matures, the data grows. Maybe your reads slow down, maybe you don't have the resources or time to redesign the app to account for that. The easiest thing is just to redirect your reads somewhere else, leaving the primary free to do writes and all of that, which was great. And I've helped many customers set that up, and it's really helped their application quite a bit without investing time and resources in actually trying to redesign it. But the downfall of that was there was only a single secondary. And then, so you would have a list, but the single secondary would essentially have to be down for the read-only routing list to point to the next one. You had no ability to load balance across those. So I've worked at a lot of customers where they had, maybe they had an availability group of 4 replicas, 1 primary, 3 secondaries. That represents a pretty significant hardware investment, and prior to 2016, you were basically paying for insurance as opposed to doing anything else. That main secondary would have to be down, then it would go to the next one. Now you can use them all, which I know customers that I've worked with on this, they're really excited about that. You can tie up a lot of money in hardware, and they want the ability to use everything they've got. And this is one way where they can do it. So a couple, or really 3 key points about this. As cool as it is, it's not load dependent yet. So in other words, SQL Server is not analyzing your workload and saying, well, so you've round robin load balanced with 3. Replica number 1 is taking 80% of the traffic, so I'm going to try to balance that out. It's not that really is round robin at this point. One request goes to one, the next goes to the next, so on and so forth. So that's something to keep in mind. A bit off topic, but still kind of relevant here, is we partner with a company called ScaleArc that builds on that. That does allow you, it does analyze the load and kind of builds on this to give you more traditional load balancing that you're expecting. But the nice thing is Microsoft offers it to us out of the box now with this version. As the second bullet there says, it utilizes all of the replica hardware, which is nice. And there's, like I just said, there's no additional software needed. There are certainly tools out there if you want them, but you don't need them. And for a lot of customers, this basic edition really meets the need that they wanted. They had all this hardware sitting out, you know, SQL licenses paid for sitting there, but you're really only using them in case of a significant disaster, and they wanted to use them all the time. Though this session isn't really a deep dive into setting all this up, just because there is so much new stuff, on a few of the slides, this one being first, I've tried to tuck in syntax examples. I'm not expecting you to remember those. There won't be a quiz on them, but you know, feel free to write them down, and it may assist Googling later. And so what I wanted to highlight here is, even though there's a lot of new things that make this technology go, the syntax for it is really not that much different than it used to be. So if you're familiar with setting up read-only routing lists, the syntax is almost the same. What you'll note here is around SQL 02 and SQL 03, so they're enclosed in the broader parentheses of the list. 02 and 03 are in their own expression there. And what that means is the round robin load balancing will take place between those two. If they're not accessible for any reason, we'll then go to 04. And that's the only syntactical change. There's nothing in the GUI yet about this that's quite like this, but it's very easy to set up here. And like I said, if there's any questions on this, tuck them into the meeting. I'll try to take a break here, maybe about halfway through, and we'll handle some of those before we launch into the demo around about halftime. So the next thing, if you've encountered any Microsoft marketing material at all, the big push on 2016 is it just runs faster. And that sounds great, and it does. It's not just marketing speak. I mean, we have customers running it. I've been at customers who just have it in kind of a proof of concept right now. And without any code changes, it does run faster. For those of us who have to deal with always-on technology, though this is especially exciting, this is one part of it that really does run faster, and it runs a lot faster. So if you dealt with always-on in any sort of a production setup prior to the release of 2016, you know that if you triggered maintenance efforts, index rebuilds, things like that, you could cause your replicas to fall behind. Anything that generates lots of transaction log traffic could cause your replicas to fall behind, depending on, you know, storage, network, things like that. Part of the reason for that was that the whole operation of capturing the log, packaging it up, encrypting it, compressing it was all single-threaded. So as you know, hardware's gotten faster, for sure storage has gotten significantly faster in the last 4 or 5 years. The always-on toolkit, if you will, was not really set up to leverage all of those new resources. So the storage and hardware was doing everything as fast as it could, which is what we want. The always-on tools would package that up and ship them off as fast as it could, but on a single thread it could only do it so fast. And you know, when you speak to the Microsoft people behind the scenes on this, one of the big pushes was they had, you know, very large enterprise level customers who really like what always-on gives you, like everything it offers in terms of being up all the time, management, things like that. This was the stumbling block, so it just wasn't fast enough. If they had invested heavily in really high horsepower hardware, it wouldn't do this well enough to support their needs at the other sites. And so the team put a tremendous amount of work into this, not just so it fit with the slogan, but so it really served customers' needs. And so you'll see in the second block of bullets there, many of these operations run in parallel now. So instead of a single thread analyzing the log, packaging it up, shipping it off to all of the replicas, you've got multiple threads doing it. By the same token, on those replicas, you've got multiple parallel redo threads doing the same thing on that end. And so as fast as they can get it, they are committing it and hardening it just as fast. And also important, the compression algorithm has improved quite a bit as well. So not only is it doing all of this faster and allowing more threads to do that, the log blocks are smaller as they travel the wire to where they're headed. So what this means for us, it all sounds cool. The Microsoft team states that they've seen 20 to 30x improvement. I was at a customer late last year where I indeed did see that, and that was a real live workload. There are TPCC benchmarks now that some folks that have used those to kind of lean on their always-on setups are seeing real-world more like 7 to 8x. I suspect the truth lies somewhere in the middle there, but the important thing is these are all realistic numbers. And so if you're in a job where it's your phone that rings when the replica falls behind, this is music to your ears, because this is real life stuff. It's not a sales sheet that says, well, it's 20 times faster, and you say that's great, and you install it, and it's 2% faster. It really is this much faster. We've seen it, we've experienced it, so that's really exciting. Kind of continuing down the path here of the ease of administration dovetailed with the speed at which you can do things with your always-on groups now. For a lot of us, this may not be that exciting. This is kind of a hidden feature. There's not a lot of sales slicks on it. But when you're working with your network operations staff and folks like that, especially if you're in an organization large enough or in a sector where you're under audits and things like that, this is a big deal. So it was actually released in Windows Server 2012. The SQL Server versions prior to this didn't really handle group managed service accounts as fully as 2016 does. And for always-on groups, this is especially useful because, as you may know, kind of the concept of it, you're dealing with the group as an entity, and so you like it all to be managed the same. You want all the security to be the same, the permissions to be the same, all that. That could get really complicated. Like I said, this is kind of a hidden feature. Day-to-day life probably doesn't change, but if you're talking about a failover scenario or really a disaster scenario where you've lost some things, having a group managed by one of these group managed service accounts instead of individual domain accounts is going to be a huge time saver for you. You don't have to chase down passwords. You don't have to remember what the service account was for this data center versus the other one, and that's all key. And so I've listed some of the benefits here. It's similar to a local managed service account if you're familiar with those. Key part is here it has domain scope. And so if you're used to, as most folks are, if you're used to regular domain accounts being your service accounts, depending on the sector that your business operates in, some auditors will flag that. And in fact, I have friends that has happened to. And so the answer to that is this: they could knock you down points on your audit if you're using just a regular domain account that's not considered to be the best practice any longer. And so anything that doesn't get flagged in an audit certainly saves everybody time, makes your operations folks happy. makes us happy, makes your security people very happy. And one key thing here is that the password synchronization is maintained across all nodes. So referring back to what I said a minute ago, I've been some places where the policies on their service accounts sometimes was limited by data center, sometimes even by machine. So if you get into a failover scenario where you've lost something, the accounts, maybe the passwords are mismatched, there's a whole level of management there that that's gone now. And so anytime you're in an unexpected failover, the less we have to do, the better. The less we have to think about, the better. It should all be muscle memory, and this really helps us handle that. This next thing is, this is another feature that I feel like really isn't getting kind of the play that it deserves. It's really cool. And so if you're used to setting up always-on AGs in the traditional way, generally the way you did that, and I won't get into the wizard and all the different modes, but whatever you did, it required a full backup to be performed at the primary, somehow transported to the replica you were setting up. A lot of times there's a series of log backups required as well, certainly at least one, and it would go through that, whether you did it through the wizard or did it manually. You'd go through all that, and that would take some time, just the physics of it. Even if you have really nice hardware, really fast network, the physics of it meant it took some time. For organizations with large databases, this was a big deal. I mean, I myself have had to answer the question, if we lose X, how long will it take us to get this back up? And sometimes, like I say, physics dictates to us the answer is a few hours. And for a lot of organizations, that's maybe not the best answer. And more importantly, there was manual intervention there. Unless you could script it, but obviously there's time and effort taken to develop those scripts. A lot of times operations staffs are overworked and oversubscribed and don't have the time to do that. And so this stuff didn't always get done. So when a replica needed to be set up on the fly, it was a big deal. It took a long time. It took a lot of work. And that, like I said, for management was not always a good answer. They were not always pleased with that. So what Microsoft has given to us here in 2016 is they haven't taken any of that away at all. If you're more comfortable doing it manually, especially with a small database or something like that, you can still do that. The old-fashioned way is still fine. Direct seeding, though, is the new way, and I'll explain what that is. It's, a lot of times folks that do what we do joke about things being auto magic. This, in a sense, really is. And so I didn't copy a full syntax example because I didn't think anybody wanted to see a wall of text slide with creating your entire AG, replicas, all that. So I've just added kind of what the new switch is. And what's important to point out here is this is in addition to the T-SQL syntax for creating your replicas. You put seeding mode equals automatic. There's no way to do this in the GUI yet. As those of you who have worked with AlwaysOn know, the GUIs are pretty friendly, but they don't contain everything. Scripting, it's usually the best answer to kind of get all the tools you want. And so what it does, you set that switch. You make sure that you grant the create any database permission to the AG itself. Make sure that the group and the nodes are configured before you add the database. So once the group is set up, once the replicas are set up and you have your structure in place, you can then add a database to the group. You add it to the primary, and this direct seeding process takes care of essentially replicating it. I hate to use that term because that's not exactly what it is, but that's basically what it is. It will put it on all the replicas. And so, and that's it. So you really, once you've set up the structure, and like I said, it's best to do that via script. Once you've done that, it takes care of the heavy lifting behind the scenes. Now it is auto magic. One caveat here, and I don't have it on the slide, is obviously the laws of physics still apply to us here. It can take some time, so it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of if you have a terabyte database, it may take hours. But what it does mean is there's no manual intervention required by a DBA to make it happen, which is wonderful. Okay, let's move on to the next. Okay, so we're here at demo time, and we're about 20 minutes in. I see the question light blinking at me. So let me go ahead and handle these. Last time I did these, we saved them all till the end. I wasn't necessarily able to get to everybody. Okay, so does direct seeding work with TDE-enabled databases? So I'll say this, I have not directly tried it with that. My understanding is, based on kind of reading the documentation surrounding that it does work, that it should work. I have not personally tested it, so there's a fairly large caveat there. And I see kind of a follow-up question on the slide that I just handled. How performant is direct seeding? It is, it's roughly equivalent to the backup restore process. It's a little cleaner, and as always, the answer to any of these performance type questions is it depends. What kind of servers you're dealing with, what kind of rails the data is riding to the other data center, what storage it's on when it gets there, things like that. So I would say it's roughly equivalent to a touch faster, but the key thing is it's easier. And it does do, it does compress some things a bit. So it's an improvement. It's not a sea change. And so, all right, I'll handle a couple more of these up top, and then we'll get back to these. Any specific change for GeoCluster setup within AlwaysOn? So if you want to, I guess I need more details probably to handle that. If you want to drop another question there, if you're talking specifically like geoclustering within Azure, if you're talking about like stretch or multi-subnet clusterings on-prem, so if you could provide more details there, I'll come back to that at the end, and I'll come back to all the ones I didn't hit at the end. So, okay, so demo time, as the slide says. So what we're going to do a couple things here. And as we know, a lot of times AlwaysOn demos, especially in an hour session, it's tough to cram a lot in. A lot of it's some pretty dry setup. A lot of it's watching progress bars and things happen. And so what I'm going to handle here is we have an AG set up in Azure that we use for demoing all this stuff. So I'm going to add a standalone instance to show you that even in Azure, that wizard is very comfortable, nearly the same in 2016. And then we're going to go through the first part of adding an Azure replica, which you've been able to do since 2014. It's a little cleaner in this version. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see it finish because it creates the VM and it creates everything behind the scenes. I'll walk you through the wizard. We'll see the first couple of green check marks, and it's unlikely that we'll be able to get back to it during this hour, but I will at least have shown you how to do it, and hopefully that's helpful, and hopefully you have resources available to you to continue walking through it. Okay, so we'll switch over from PowerPoint to our VMs. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this screen. What this is the primary replica of the availability group we have set up in Azure. And so for those of you who have added replicas in the past, hopefully this demo is kind of old hat. But I think we have a good mix of people who are experienced hands with AlwaysOn versus people who are maybe new-ish to it or maybe brand new to it. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through this just to show you. So these are Azure VMs running SQL Server. This is not Azure SQL database. That dealing with AlwaysOn is a bit different and probably a good subject for another talk, but out of our scope for today's session. So what we do here, I've already gone ahead and expanded this, and let me take a minute to talk about kind of what went on behind the scenes to make this happen. Because I'm adding a standalone instance as opposed to an Azure replica, we stood up another VM, which is Server 3. We've gone ahead and done everything you traditionally do to get a replica ready. So we've stood it up. We've added the failover clustering feature. Once we go ahead and do that, of course, it triggers a couple of reboots during that process. You then, and in fact, I'll show you on this. This is a step that a lot of people forget, and it's easy to forget, but I want to highlight this because in order to add a node, one thing you have to do is you go to the properties of your SQL Server service, and actually that's not showing here. So what it is, it's in Configuration Manager. I'm not going to go to that because I want to get to everything I've got. But one thing you have to do is there's an always-on high availability tab on the service itself, and you need to make sure that that is enabled. So if your clustering setup is proper, you'll go to the properties of your service, and you'll see that, and you'll see the correct cluster name there. You want to go ahead and add that. Like I said, it's a bit out of the scope of this, but it's something I always try to mention when we're talking about setting this up because I think it's the easiest step to forget. But anyhow, so we've set up a machine, which is Server 3. It's part of the cluster. The cluster is healthy, and that's all important when we go to add this. And so this, as I said, for those of you who've done it before, should be pretty traditional. And so we right-clicked on it, and we go to Add Replica. It's going to require us to connect to the existing replicas. So we're going to go ahead and connect to Server 2, which is a readable secondary configured for automatic failover. We'll see that here in just a bit. And so, yeah, you can see it right there. When you highlight Server 2, it does give you this nice little window that tells you what the replica mode is, and it's synchronous commit with automatic failover. It tells you it's also a readable secondary, which means it's available to be configured for read-only routing. And so we're going to go ahead and add our Server 3 replica. I'll show you just how easy this is. So we're going to connect to Server 3. We've used the same account there for everything. So by default, and I'm not going to change this, but I want to show you how you can. By default, you can add this replica. It's going to add it as async, which means we won't get too deep into the weeds on that, but it basically means that the primary is not waiting for this node to commit for operations to continue. So this can fall behind, generally without impacting performance on the primary. And it's not configured to be a readable secondary at all. So in a traditional setup, you know, a lot of times if you have a backup data center, backup location, you'll have an always-on node that that operates only, you know, it's always keeping up, but it operates only in case of a significant disaster where the primary data center has gone away. And other than that, you're not too concerned about what it does. And so for the purposes of this, that's basically what we're setting up here. Key thing here, so it says that I could configure this for automatic failover, and this is a key feature, maybe a little bit out of scope of this, but I want to highlight it. Between 2014 and 2016, you could always have 3 synchronous replicas in either version. In 2014, you could only have 2 automatic failover targets. I have a slide that dives into this a little more later, but this wizard kind of calls it out. You can select a 3rd here, which is cool and an improvement over 2014. A lot of customers felt like just having the 2 automatic failover partners really kind of tied their hands behind their back when the failover scenarios got a bit complicated. Microsoft heard that and added this to 2016. So we click Next. I'll briefly go over the 3 modes here. So full, this is the auto magiciest. Basically all you need here is you need to share that this server and the replica server can see that the service accounts on either side can connect to read and write. And the wizard, as you'll see here in a minute, will take care of the backup and restore both of the database itself and the log backup that's needed. They'll do that all for you. You'll get a nice little green check mark rundown. Very easy. Join only is if you prefer to do that manually, And so you've already made the backup, you've restored it on the replica with no recovery, and you're just going through you're kind of putting the finishing touches on it here. Skip initial data sync is you're doing this first. So it's kind of the flip side of join only. You're doing this first, you're going to take your backups and kind of get it going later. So we're going to choose the full option because it's a demo and we want to keep things moving and see progress bars and all that good stuff. And so what we're going to do, we're going to click next here. It's going to go through a validation, which is pretty self-explanatory. Generally in your environment, most likely, the listener configuration will be a green check mark as well. For a couple different reasons, we've decided not to configure a listener in this environment. So that's a warning for us, doesn't affect our demo, and odds are you won't see it. Generally, people who are using Always On in a productive environment will configure a listener because that gives you access to read-only routing and all the other cool stuff that it does. So we're going to go ahead and click next here. It's going to summarize what it's about to do. This is pretty dry, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But it's showing you the instance, the role, the replica mode that you've chosen, whether it's readable or not, the name of the endpoint, the URL with the port, is it encrypted? Yes. Service account, automated backup priority. It's a bit out of scope of this talk, but if you choose to offload backups to your replicas, you can set the priority and like how the replicas are organized and which one will handle the backups. And so, as always, you can choose to script this out. We're not going to. We're going to stick with the GUI because it's a demo, and we want, we want to see it happen. So we're going to go to finish here. So I always click more details, and we should see green check marks right down the way. As you'll note, we're using wide world importers. AdventureWorks is no more. Wide world importers is the newness, and so that's the new sample database from Microsoft. And so we're trying to use that on all of our 2016 environments, even though it feels a bit weird to write SQL that does not say use AdventureWorks in it. So as you can see, it finished. So we've got to close there. And so one kind of gotcha. I wouldn't call it a bug, but it's something to keep in mind. You'll note here we have the 3 nodes, so it looks like it's good. What can be a bit alarming after you first set it up is you see the red down arrow there, which is that's not always what we're looking to see. But in this case, it's fine. It just means this hasn't refreshed. So we click on the replicas tree, we click refresh, and we've got happy greenness on all 3, which is what we want to see. Now I've gone ahead and connected to server 3 down here, and we're going to refresh that, and you'll see it shows synchronizing. Because it's in async mode, you won't necessarily see synchronized there. And so that is that's adding in Azure, but we're using VMs. That's adding a standalone instance in 2016. Another thing I want to show you guys before we hop back into the slides is we're going to add another replica. We're going to add it as an Azure replica. And like I said, unfortunately, we won't get to see this finish, but I do want to show you guys how to get through it because this is, I feel, kind of an underdocumented thing. And especially if you're wishing to add Azure replicas to kind of enhance your on-prem AG, they've provided really a very handy way to do it. So we've connected to both of our replicas. This is the screen we just saw. We're not going to worry about these tabs. Those would be in the scope for another talk. But you can define your endpoints, backup preferences, and listener there if you wish. We're going to go to Add Azure Replica. We're going to sign in here. So apologies for the very dry typing portion of the presentation here this afternoon. Go ahead and sign in. And so you see it will pull up your subscription. As you'll note down here, it says loading subscription information. And so then it takes a few seconds to populate all this. So without getting heavily into it, as I mentioned, there was a lot of work done by our team to simulate an on-premise domain in Azure. This is it. So if you're extending this from your actual on-premise domain, odds are you're going to see something similar. You're going to see the name, the username you used to set it up. We're going to go ahead and fill all of this in. And I'll kind of briefly go over the options. Most everything here is specific to ours. but I'll kind of hit the highlights. So we're going to use, this is where you can choose the VM image that you want. We're going to use SQL Server 2016 Enterprise. We'll get to standard support for availability groups later, but for this we're going to use Enterprise on Server 2012. Large VM is fine for now. We're going to give it a name that relates to our other machines. We're going to type the super secret password. Okay, so what we've done here, we've selected an image, and so since we're dealing with SQL Server 2016, we want to continue to do that. VM size, this is greatly dependent on what your subscription is, what your resources are, things like that. Those are the options on ours. Your mileage may vary here, and obviously depending on what kind of performance you want. For what we're doing here, we're just setting this up. Performance, not a big deal, so we'll stick with the default. I would say, depending on what your naming scheme is, the name obviously is going to be important. Some places we go, they identify their Azure boxes differently, and so you may want to highlight that in the name here. We're acting like this is an on-premise thing, so we're going to stick with that. The username and administrator password is obviously your choice. We could do a whole nother session on this, but the virtual network and the subnet are important. They all need to talk to each other. And we went over the domain stuff previously. So as you can see, if you've set up an Azure VM before and you've connected it to your on-prem network, these are all going to be comfortable choices for you, hopefully. And so we're going to go ahead and validate this. You need to agree to the license because it is actually going to set this up. We're going to scroll down here and we're going to see that we have a new secondary, and it is also async, not readable. And so we're going to hit next. Synchronization preference, quite similar here. If you don't have shares available where both your Azure machines and your on-prem machines can write to, then you might want to choose join only here. We don't have to do that. So we'll click next. You're going to see a similar validation here. This is going to take a minute, but it's basically checking, have you created a server, name this, is the cluster online, will the new VM be able to see the cluster, is the endpoint encrypted, all those sorts of things. Now we click next, and this is the screen we saw before, but there's a lot more summary information here as we're creating a brand new VM. So it gives you all the details on that. One key thing to point out is it automatically opens the firewall ports. So SQL Server can talk on 1433, mirroring can talk on 5022, and those are the defaults there. So it does that automatically for you. Then we click Finish, and unfortunately we won't see this, but you can see it configuring the endpoints, creating the Azure service, and it's going to spin here quite a bit. And actually, yeah, because there's another firewall rule that we have to handle. So we won't actually see this finish. We've got to we have to change the DNS setup in our AG. But basically, this would have finished. I don't feel like you guys probably want to see it get hardcore in the editing DNS entries, and so we'll get back to the slides from here. Okay, so we highlighted this in the demo, but I want to talk about this a little more. We have an increased number of auto failover targets in 2016. So 2012 and 2014 only allowed one synchronous automatic failover target. So like I said, if you were used to dealing with clusters, probably it was very comfortable for you, and I definitely have talked to customers where they would refer to the primary and the replica as active-passive, kind of using that old cluster terminology, which is not what Microsoft wanted us to call it, but if you came from a failover cluster background, it's just kind of a natural thing to fit into. And we didn't have any flexibility beyond that. Now we do. 2016, as I mentioned, allows 2 synchronous automatic failover targets. And so that gives us really a total of 3 that we can juggle, so you can handle some pretty complicated failover scenarios as a part of that. as I showed you guys, that we were in the Add Replica wizard. This is configured in the Availability Group properties. So if you find your AG, you right-click on it, you go to Properties. There's a panel in there where you can designate your automatic failover targets, and it looks just like what we did. It's just a different way to get to it. So one thing, as I've set this up, it's a bit hard to chase down information that documents what the failover order is, basically. So obviously when you introduce the third, what goes first, second, and third? When you only have two, it's pretty straightforward. With three, it's less straightforward. There's been a lot of questions about it. And there was an excellent, very, very recent PFE blog that went into this. So it's not necessarily readily documented, but Microsoft did provide us the information. So what it is, it's defined by the preferred owner list of the failover cluster manager. So if you're familiar with or comfortable with going into the cluster manager, you'll see this there. You can right-click on the cluster, you go to properties, there you can get to the preferred owner list that way. A little sidebar here. If you're not familiar with going in the cluster manager and looking at the cluster that your AlwaysOn AG rides on top of, definitely do that. It's a big, I've seen the most successful AlwaysOn implementers that I've worked with, that I've been to. The relationship between the database staff and the network operations staff is healthy, and there's a lot of information sharing. And so if you're a DBA who's fortunate enough to work with these big AlwaysOn setups, get to know your network ops folks and make sure you're able to see this stuff, because it's important. Because if the cluster is broken, your AG will go down. But generally, the understanding of all the moving parts is not nuanced enough for them to understand, for anybody outside of the group to understand, and they're going to call your phone or knock on your door. And so the more you understand about this, the faster the troubleshooting goes. So an important point here, you can change it. When you go into the cluster manager properties, you have the ability to move replicas up and down the list. That said, Microsoft officially says this is generally maintained by SQL Server. In my testing, what I have seen is it will change the order on you. The cluster reigns supreme over the choices you make here, and anybody who's probably, especially like a test cluster where you're changing a lot of values and behavior just to kind of see what happens. If you're used to doing that, you've experienced this, where you change something in the list, you go back to it sometime later, and you say, I swear I changed this, and you did. But the cluster assumes it knows better, it generally does, and changes it back. So the official advice from Microsoft, if you have a preferred automatic failover order, and generally when you're setting up something where you've got 3 synchronous automatic failover targets, this is a big setup. Odds are you've designed it and sketched it out beforehand. If not, please do so. It's going to make your life much easier. So what you'll want to do, as the bullet says, you're going to want to add replicas in the preferred automatic failover order. And so you'll add replicas just the way that I showed you earlier. As long as that's consistent with your design, you'll get consistent behavior when the automatic failovers take place. Now this is kind of new, and again, some of these improvements are subtle, but for those of us who spend a lot of time with AlwaysOn setups in production, there's some really key, nice things here. So failover used to depend on instance health, especially automatic failover, which is really what this slide talks about. AlwaysOn AGs were designed to provide database level redundancy, but the failover, the automatic failover in general is an instance or cluster health related event. So obviously if the cluster went down, the AG would fail over trying to kind of reestablish a relationship with a cluster whose attitude had changed. If you lost a database within your AG, the AG would not fail over. Now you could build a lot of heavy scripting on top of that to force its hand, but the automatic failover wouldn't automatically do it. And I have absolutely worked with customers this has happened to, is they lose an application database with and there's some outage, and management comes down and says, I thought this was configured to automatically fail over. What happened? What happened is if there's not an operations staff kind of sitting right on it, the database in there could fail, and if your alerting's not set up right, the team didn't know, the AG is going to happily go along thinking everything's okay because it was less concerned with the health of the databases within it. Thankfully, in SQL 2016, that has changed. The default behavior is still the same. So if you just go through and you click you just go next, 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 and set up all this stuff, that behavior is the same. You can have a database that has an issue, whether it loses a data file or what have you, within the AG. The AG will go along and say, I'm happy and healthy, everything's okay. But thankfully for those of us who have had a manager breathing down our necks saying, thought this was configured to automatically fail over, why didn't it? We have the ability to change that now. So when you're creating the availability group, which is a big T-SQL statement that I'm not going to repaste here, there's a DB failover switch now. If you set that to on, if a database within the availability group becomes unhealthy, the automatic failover is triggered. So in a scenario where that's important, where if you lose a database within that group, you must go over to one of the secondaries, definitely set this up because it will prevent the manager showing up at your door or calling your phone irate saying this was automatic, but it's not. Now it really and truly is, in the way that people not spending every day with these understand it. Okay, I'm going to touch on this briefly. It probably deserves its own session, and hopefully I get to do that at some point, but we just wanted to give a really high level on all the features here. So previously, always on, and it was frustrating for some people, it was Enterprise Edition only. And as we know, Enterprise Edition is more expensive, so you talk to some people and they say, well, that always on AG stuff's really cool, but we don't have the for Enterprise, so it's not a good answer for us. Microsoft has made some of the functionality available to you if you have standard. And so I call it database mirroring on steroids. If you're familiar with mirroring, if you used it when it came to us in Service Pack 1 in 2005 or since then, it's actually, so it's been officially deprecated, still in the product, but obviously when something's deprecated, the recommendation is not to use it. But they've replaced it with this. So it's called Basic Availability Groups. And yes, the acronym is BAG. And yes, Microsoft is not always the very, very best at coming up with awesome sounding acronyms for what is some pretty cool stuff. And so, as I noted, similar behavior, it's not as fully featured, and we're going to get to that here. It's limited to a single database, so in that respect, it's very similar to mirroring. Read-only routing is not an option for this. This really is kind of, it is a high availability option for sure, but it's not a solution to distributing reads. You know, if you have a database that's kind of getting overwhelmed with those. I prefer to describe it like this. It's really a gateway to the enterprise functionality. It's managed very similarly. You get a lot of the same GUIs and things like that, but you can't offload reads to your replica, which you can only have one, and you can't offload backups as well. So some of the compelling selling points for larger customers with the basic availability group stuff, you don't have that. But it's a nice way to get your feet wet with it, and if you have a single database that's powering an application and you have a limited budget, it's a really nice answer because you're getting basically fully supported and fully enhanced database mirroring with all the nice always-on stuff, the better compression and all that. So if you're still on mirroring because it really answered the question for you and you were real happy with it, but you're concerned that it's going to go away, definitely switch to this, get comfortable with it, and it's going to fill in nicely for you there. Okay, so we've got a couple more slides here, and these features are a bit off the beaten path, but I feel like they've been under-documented, not really sold, and for some specific customers, these are huge. And so I wanted to highlight these because, you know, I think as whether it affects your organization or if you have colleagues that you cross paths with, knowledge of some of this stuff is going to be handy and potentially save somebody not only a lot of time and effort, but maybe a lot of money, and we all like to do that. So it is an availability group of availability groups. I tried to find a family-friendly slide with funny acronyms on it. I was unable. So here is a picture of a cat studying the AlwaysOn documentation intently. But yeah, so some of the Microsoft documentation calls this a DAG or a DAG of AGs. Doesn't roll off the tongue, but what's important to understand from that is a distributed availability group is really an availability group of availability groups, and that's why I've titled the slide like that. Is it gives you a way, it's a different way to handle multiple data centers, what some of you guys might call stretch clusters, things like that. It's a different design, different topology that may fit some customers better. And so what it does is it allows the setup of an AG across 2 Windows Server failover clusters, which is pretty cool. Used to be limited to just one, and for some customers it wasn't a good option. They've got very complicated network, or customers making a lot of acquisitions, you're trying to fold all that in, and AlwaysOn just wasn't a good answer because it was difficult to combine all that. Now we don't quite have to do that. Each node, and this is where the terminology can get a bit confusing, each node, which is really an availability group, can have its own quorum mode and node voting configuration. Those are cluster terms. If you're not familiar with those, ask a question. I can hope to get to it. Clustering probably deserves its own session as well. But so the clusters are independent of each other. So if you lose one or the other, does not impact the health of the other cluster, which is nice. Another cool feature is that one time and replicated within the cluster. So for instance, I was talking to a customer recently who was debating having a 4-node setup at their primary data center, a 4-node setup at their backup data center. And we talked about using this, and one of the selling points they had is that the data traveled the wire from the primary to the backup data center once, even though there were 4 machines over there. Once it got there, it was distributed to the 4, but for most of us, the network in your data center is substantially better and faster than your wide area. And so it's nice the way this is handled. It's not sending the data 4 times because there's 4 machines down there. It sends it once, and it's handled on site. Key thing here is the primary and secondary AG must have the same configuration of databases. And this is where this gets a little confusing, but also kind of exciting. You can actually have different versions of Windows between the 2 clusters. So one could be running 2016 Technical Preview 5. One could be running Server 2012 R2. That's okay, as long as the configuration of the databases in the group are the same. And so from that sense, it does look like a broader AG, but it doesn't force your hand to upgrade or downgrade everything just to get it to play nice in here. So the benefits, we've already talked about a couple of those. Health of secondary cluster does not impact the primary cluster. So when you have distributed data centers that are distributed geographically, this can be nice. Automatic failover is not supported. I have a feeling that's coming, but that would be a bit hairy. This is something you'll want to failover manually. There's a lot of moving parts here. The other thing is the AGs can be configured independently. So if you want to have different automatic failover targets, things like that, you can do those, depending on what each site needs and who's using those replicas and for what. This is another one. I have talked to 2 customers for whom this is huge. For everybody else, you may not have known that DTC wasn't really supported with AlwaysOn anyway. A lot of folks don't use it, and that's okay. But for the customers who need it, this is huge. I mean, we have one specifically who this is what kept them from AlwaysOn. They liked all the functionality. The management team was really excited about it. Their particular application used DTC heavily, and so AlwaysOn was not an answer for them. And so they didn't have the HADR setup that they really desired because of that. Now they can, and so that's exciting for them. Another thing to point out here is if you use Entity Framework, and I know that's gaining in popularity, if you're supporting applications developed using Entity Framework, its connection pooling behavior would escalate transactions to be distributed transactions as traffic picked up. And I'm not going to get way into the weeds on that, but the more the application was used, occasionally transactions would be escalated to be distributed. That could cause a significant problem in SQL Server versions before this. Big problems with applications that were difficult to troubleshoot. So if you're supporting an application using Entity Framework and they have, basically you're suffering performance-wise because of that, one way to mitigate it is this. You can upgrade to 2016. And now the DTC support is there, and the framework likes that very much. And the highlight here is there's no configuration changes needed. If you have an application that's using it, it'll use it. There's no switches that you as the DBA has to throw, and there's nothing that you have to do. It's just there. Okay, last thing, and this is exciting for some, but it's a little bit down the road. So if anybody's running any of the Windows Server technical previews or planning to upgrade to Windows Server down the line, when you get to Server 2016, you're going to have the ability to set up domain-independent AGs, which is pretty exciting. Previously, like we said, you were wedded to a single cluster. You were wedded to a single domain. That's no longer the case. And so, like I said, for large or even not so large companies that are acquiring a lot of people or folding in a lot of new clients or something like that, single domain deal was a deal breaker, like the bullet point says there. If you had a complicated AD topology, AlwaysOn was not the answer for you because you couldn't do it. And so this is exciting for those folks. There are basically 4 different ways that it's supported, and go ahead and disregard the 2 bullet points about database and read-only routing. It's not the case. But so these domain-independent availability groups, diags, if you will, there's kind of 4 ways they're supported. So you can have all the nodes in a single domain, very traditional way. You can have nodes across multiple domains with full trust, which kind of makes sense. It didn't support that before, but it's kind of an intuitive thing for it to do. You can have nodes in multiple domains with no trust, which is definitely something it did not offer, and very exciting, like I said, for those folks where the topology is very complicated. And you can have nodes in no domain at all, which is brand new. So as long as you can set the cluster up and it's working, the domain relationship won't matter. But you have to be on Windows Server 2016 to have this. So unless you're running one of the previews, this will be later in the year for you. Questions? I know we have several. Hopefully I can get back to them all. I know we only have 2 minutes left. But like I said, you can find me on Twitter at SQL@Speed, and I'll answer as many of them as I can there, as long as 140 characters or so will work. Okay, so we've got, so let me scroll down to the bottom and work my way back. So can you create a snapshot to read from? So I assume that's related to the basic availability group question. The answer is yes. I've set that up. It's a pretty comfortable way to do it. And so if you're comfortable using mirroring, basic availability groups basically is where you need to be. So let's see, can the default failover mode be changed after the AG is created? Yeah, so that in the properties box, like I showed you guys when we added the replica, that's a fluid box. If you want to change your failover targets, change whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, that can be done on the fly, and for a lot of failover scenarios, it should be. And so that's, yes, that can be changed. I see the question here about SSIS packages and jobs. High availability in SSIS is really cool. Unfortunately, I only had an hour. There's only so much I could jam into here. That's a great idea for a future session. I'd like to get to that. I know that's a topic that, like some of the stuff I talked about late in this, is really important to some folks, but a bit off the beaten path. So I will take that under advisement and hopefully do another session on that. Okay, we are at noon. I will take one more here. Okay, so just to kind of highlight, so it says, so no need to restore full and log backups and no need for non-recovery mode, just direct seeding, do the magic. With reference to direct seeding, basically yes. Now it's going to be doing that behind the scenes. It's going to do it a little cleaner, a little faster, and you don't have to do it, but it is doing more or less the same thing. But yeah, if you're joining stuff in the traditional way where you're taking a full backup, taking a log backup, restoring it no recovery on the replica, and doing scripting, direct seeding takes away the need to do that. And on that note, I think I used every bit of that last minute. Liz, can I turn it back over to you?
Absolutely. I know a couple of you have asked about the video recording. You will receive an email tomorrow with a link if you need that. Matt, do you mind throwing up your contact information on the screen one last time?
Sure.
And if you happen to forget this information, you can always email me, Liz, and I'll be happy to pass along Matt's information or any questions you may have. Matt, are you going to make your slides available?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Just tell me how to do that.
Okay.
Who I need to
So
provide those to.
Matt can send them to me. So if you guys are interested in the PowerPoint slides, just email me, Liz, and I'll be happy to pass those along as soon as I get them. And then I know we didn't get to all the questions, so I will send them to Matt, and if maybe he can write up a blog if he has some time, just to quick answer those questions or just do a general overview. We will let you know if that gets posted.
Yeah, I saw some that I wanted to get to in there, but they would require a depth that we didn't have time for. But I do intend to do a subsequent blog getting into some of the deeper questions we got there that we're going to take more than a quick answer.
Okay, great. Well, I will get those questions to Matt. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everybody.